Hello, and welcome to our panel on urgent call for a new development paradigm that works for people and planet. My name is Josiane Gauthier. I'm Secretary General of CIDSE, an international family of social justice organizations, Catholic organizations based in Brussels and Belgium. We have a very interesting panel with 4 people from around the world. Our panel is to address faith actors, justice actors, youth actors, mobilizing to change the paradigm, which will address the climate crisis. We know that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is a matter of survival, of life and death, and it's a moral imperative in this meaning. Because the dramatic risks are the highest on the vulnerable groups, the vulnerable populations around the world, the ones that are holding this forum, climate change is not only an environmental problem, but also humanitarian, a human, a development urgency of global proportions. And that's why we need to rethink the entire economies and societies which have led to this climate crisis, the root causes of the situation we're in now. And this means that the development model that we're working with has to be based on justice, on equity, and put people at the center of everything we do. People we have joined together in this panel are all bringing their stories of faith, of justice, of youth in action to mobilize and to change that paradigm and build something new which will address climate change, but not just climate change, justice and a new development model. I want to highlight that we've organized this panel together with our partners, Global Catholic Climate Movement, Climate Tracker, Green Faith, and 350.org. And remind you as well that though we have 2 panelists that are live, 2 are pre-recorded, and you can send your questions in by using the hashtags on social media for tweeting, hashtag Virtual Climate Summit, or hashtag CBF Summit Panel. Our 4 speakers are Archbishop Tesfa Selassie Medin, Bishop of the Ethiopian Catholic Eparchy of Adigrat in Ethiopia, and he is pre-recorded. We also have Mrs. Melania Chiponda, Energy and Climate Justice Campaigns Coordinator of Women in South Africa, and she's with us live. And then we have Joseph Sapati Monokolio, a youth representative from the Pacific, also with us live, and a pre-recorded message from Olivier de Schutter, co-chair, International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We'll begin by hearing the pre-recorded video of Archbishop Tesfa Selassie Medin, and he's bringing stories of the situation in Ethiopia and how faith actors are mobilizing to tackle climate change and address the root causes and the moral imperative of addressing these root causes.
I am Bishop Tesfa Selassie Medin from Ethiopia Catholic Diocese of Adigrat. It is my great pleasure to participate in this Climate Vulnerable Forum Summit online panel with you, and it is a great concern of life and death that so many countries are now highly vulnerable to the warming planet. The consequences are disastrous, already seen in the lives of nature and in the lives of peoples. And in this scenario, the role of faith actors in pushing the all stakeholders to act on this climate change addressing situations. The ambition for climate and achieving the justice goal is the ultimate role and mission of faith actors. I believe that the Catholic Church and all other faith actors have a mission to save God's creation, to speak for justice, and that the achievement for the goals on which the scientists and humanity has believed that is going to crunch the continuity of life on Earth, on the planet. Pope Francis in Laudato Si has called that the solutions are of importance and urgency, and it can also only happen by common agreement in solidarity and unified action. For this, the member countries for Climate Vulnerable Forum Summit are called also to push forward, along with other humanity, that the Paris Agreement to halt the growth of temperature and to maintain it below 1.5 degrees centigrade. This urgency means life and death, both for humans and for livestock. As an example, in my country, Ethiopia, the policy both of the government and of the faith actors is very much focused in solving this with strategic solutions that are to be seen globally also as a solution. Focus on the renewable energy, and then the development that is based on consumerism and mass production has by the developed countries calls for another transformation of the lifestyle. When I can imagine in the metropolitan cities of the developed world, the cost of garbage removal of big city is almost a budget of one developing country, and this is extremely exemplar, visible thing of what is produced. What is thrown is more, and that is also something which contributes to the destruction of the balanced ecosystem and pollution. The seas, the rivers, the air, and all these have more impact on the poor people. The developed countries and communities may have for the time being, some coping potential, but finally they also will be losers. But already at hand in the Pacific area, island cities are already submerged with the rising water levels. In dry areas, the desertification is expanding, and also big companies, multinational companies, mining companies, this destruction of the natural forests, especially in the equatorial regions like Amazonia, like Congo Basin, and also southeastern Pacific areas, then this kind of problems that happen in one part of our planet is something that is also a chain consequence on other. Therefore, the role of youth, the role of faith actors and faith groups mobilizing this climate justice, ecological justice, and a move for the transformation, for a change in style of life is of utmost importance and ethical imperative that does not have to delay, but something that has to be observed very fast and in a systemic approach, or addressing the root causes. Therefore, in a very recent statement, the bishops in Rome have proposed the entire Continental Bishops' Conference of the Catholic Church, and also the rest of humanity has to follow the principles that give respect to nature, respect to environment, respect to life continuity, and the application of Laudato Si principles in general for the care for our home planet. The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are one. They are one and they need one solution. The most impacted communities in agricultural, food security, water resource, and health sectors is the most affected and the most impacted part. Therefore, with this in view and with this situation, the panelists today, we have a common message to portray, that the Climate Vulnerable Forum Summit by heads of governments of member states is a grand call that we make, that this respect for the agreement that was done in Paris for controlling and contributing to the halting of the rising warming of the planet, and also for the environmental protection, focusing on the renewable energy and development that is of more justice, equitable distribution, equitable access to the resources of the earth. With this message, I wish that the common message of this panel could reach the ears and the hearts of all those who could follow this short message. God bless you, God bless our planet, and God bless all those who work for the care and concern of our common home, the planet, the earth.
So we've just heard from Bishop Medin, and he helped us to frame the moral context or moral imperative, and also sort of give some signals of what the faith community can be doing to push leaders to take their responsibilities, recognizing that much has to do with our lifestyles, our conditions, our consumerism, our society of waste and growth, which creates great inequality and is a violation and a violence towards creation. And the importance of connecting those issues together, that climate is not distinct from the issues of life in general and of justice and of human relations and politics and economy. He also talks about the respect and the dignity that has to be present in a new way of living and a new way of life. And that we have to bring our messages together and have a common and strong call, especially for the Paris Agreement, which has to be implemented in a respectful way and putting the most vulnerable communities first. I think that this first framing is really helpful because it sets the ethical parameter in which this conversation has to happen, which is not just political and not just financial and not just economic. And it's not just about the environment or the climate specifically, it's about the impact of all that we do and how we tackle it through a common systemic approach to things. So now I would pass it on to Mrs. Melania Chipanda, who will offer us her testimony, her story of experiences as an ecofeminist in Africa. She's Energy and Climate Justice Campaigns Coordinator at Women, which is the African Women Unite Against Destructive Resource Extraction. And Melania is an ecofeminist working on energy and climate justice for African, indigenous, peasant, and working class women. So really looking at it from that perspective, Melania will share her experience and some examples of how women are proposing alternatives as well. For energy access, for climate justice, and for more democratized renewable energy solutions. Thank you, Melania.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to just acknowledge what has been said by the previous speaker, the issue of lifestyles, consumerism, and what constitutes a good life. And this is part of the big challenge that we are facing. having a development model that focuses on profits, which is growth oriented, which looks at economic growth as development, and therefore it is based on very expensive lifestyles, extravagant lifestyles, but which create inequalities and impact very negatively on peasants, working class women in terms of issues of global warming, issues of climate change. If we look at the current development model, it has not changed much from the Second World War, where development was regarded as industrializing, modernizing, and emulating the West and emulating the lifestyles in the US, which were extremely profit-oriented. And a lot of countries that were colonies then, they were there were proposals towards a development process which is very alien to the people. And I would like to focus mostly on Africa, that it was a development model which was a continuation of a process of colonialism. And as an ecofeminist challenging all these different phases of the development model, which is extremely profit-oriented, neoliberal, which is very patriarchal in nature, and which is very extremely destructive to the environment, and where the environment and nature is given monetary value. And also the work that women are doing is pushed to the periphery or is not given any value, is devalued, yet women are making tremendous contributions to the economy through social reproduction. And also, particularly for Africa, women as food producers. In Africa, women are producing almost 70% of the food that we are eating, and globally it is 50% of the food that we are eating is produced by women, whether in subsistence economies or in the commercial food production processes. And this work is often devalued, and this is part of the challenge of climate change, where a development model is unjust to particular groups, and where a development model also takes land and other natural resources as goods or capital that has to be extracted. And therefore, we could say the current development model is extractivist in nature, where everything has to be extracted for a profit. And therefore, the energy sector being the main driver of this development model, we all understand that we need energy. We need energy to develop. People need energy. But the current energy system, the way it is structured, it is unjust. The way it is produced and the way it is distributed, it is unjust. Looking back at countries, I'll give an example of Zimbabwe, where during the colonial system, the energy sector was mainly coal, and it was meant to industrialize the country and also drive the development process. But if we look at it, it was extremely unjust to the indigenous groups. It was extremely unjust to the women mostly. And the contributions that women were making, they were invisible. Women remained invisible. Indigenous peoples remained extremely, extremely exploited, just the same way that the environment is being exploited. And therefore, we see this link between the development model in its current form and climate change, because the energy sector itself is contributing like around 80% of the greenhouse gases, And therefore, it is also part of the problem, the kind of energy that we are using and what the energy is being used for. Energy right now is mainly for production, and any energy that peasants, working class women have access to is dirty, and if they have access to clean energy, it is actually incidental. And that on its own reduces women's resilience to climate change, particularly for Africa, which lies on the tropics. If we would look back at then what was it like, or what should the alternative look like? We start probably look at what are women fighting for? What are they pushing back on? A lot of women in Africa are organizing and pushing back on coal because of its impact on their bodies, because of its impact on the environment. A lot of African women and other women from the global south, the world over, they are also pushing back on mega energy projects, which are very devastating to the environment, which are extremely destructive to the environment. They are pushing back on industrial agriculture, which is taking over the commons, and they are fighting back and pushing back on a development model that is impoverishing. And probably the discussion should also look at then what is the solution? How do we ensure that we move towards a development model that is not harmful, which is an alternative to the current model? And the answer really is there are people who are living the alternatives. We have women who are working on the land, who are involved in agroecology, who are fighting back on commercial seeds. I will give an example of the women in Uganda who are actually fighting to protect their own indigenous seeds, which they exchange amongst themselves and which they understand actually better, which are suitable for their climate, as opposed to the seeds that are produced by transnationals and multinationals, which are hybrid and cannot be used, and therefore not sustainable for them to keep on producing food. So if we look at those struggles, that should inform where we want to move towards. We have communities in countries like the DR Congo, which are fighting for the protection of their forests. The women who identify themselves as forest people, whose livelihoods, whose lives and well-being depend on the forests, and the fertility of their own agricultural soil depending a lot on the forest. But this is facing extinction due to development or due to a huge mega energy project, the Inga 3. And communities are saying no to the destruction of their Congo River, which is their source of livelihood, which is their source of well-being. And they are fighting back on this development model that is extremely harmful to them. And to us as women pushing back on this extractivist development model, we are saying that is a starting point in starting to interrogate how the alternative should look like. We have countries like Zimbabwe, where women are actually saying no to industrial agriculture, who are questioning mono agriculture, who are questioning plantation economies and challenging how this is development to them, and how and what that in industrial agriculture means to themselves, to their families, to their livelihoods. So we are starting to interrogate if we are going to be moving into that alternative, that economy which is just for women in Africa, for indigenous peoples and indigenous groups all over the world. How should we transition?
Sorry. I have to stop you because we lack time, but we'll come back, and maybe I can help if we have a little time for Q&A. It'll be an opportunity to finish with some more examples, but unfortunately we're really controlled for time, and I want to give some time to Joe, and we have another speaker, but hold that thought, please. Don't lose it, and we'll come back to it. And maybe Joe can continue on with that, because there is that interconnection, of course, of the value system of the model and how it's affecting creation and life and culture as well. Joseph Sapati-Monocolio, who's a youth representative from the Pacific and is very involved in the climate movement, but is coming from more of a personal journey towards climate justice, and is now very, very much involved in the struggle and in the fight, and is preparing for work at COP24. So can you share with us, Joe, please, your take on this and the contribution of how youth can take charge of this very complicated issue and take it forward with us?
Sure, certainly. Well, tala falava and good morning from my side of the world. I want to start off by firstly thanking you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion, and I also want to offer my congratulations to President Heine as well, and the RMI team for putting together the summit and for the innovation that allows us to come together in a way that cuts any travel-induced emissions. I think the Climate Vulnerable Forum and also next month's COP meeting in Poland is a great opportunity to practice co-responsibility. We are at a time now when the effects of industrialization and overconsumption has pushed us to this near breaking point, and it's a moment where we should now reflect on the role that we must all play in correcting our course and ensuring that we leave a habitable planet for current and future generations. This call is based on core principles of human dignity and the right to live securely in a habitable and safe environment. So it is our work to ensure that these principles are upheld with more ambitious climate action and with robust climate policies. So going on to your point of what young people can do, when I think of climate change and when I see everything that comes of it, it's young people and particularly young women who are the first victims of this crisis. So an intergenerational solidarity is vital in this effort. In saying that, though, it's young people and young women who are also picking up the slack, who are leading from the front, and who are energizing communities, energizing their peers, and even their political leaders. So it's in this respect that we must harness the skills and the idealism of the young people to drive the course forward, because after all, we're the ones who have to inherit the consequences of our decisions today, be they good or bad. And the situation is urgent, and the urgency of it, we all know about. We all see that that time is running out. We're all seeing that despite the warnings, there's still a lot of pushback. So we also need to reflect on what's going wrong. Where are we failing to communicate this urgency in a way that will cause people to receive it and act on it? And I think this is an area where we have seen the faith and the cultural approaches as particularly fruitful, with language that opens people up in ways that perhaps political or scientific arguments can't. This is something we're also seeing young people who are able to discuss climate change in relatable ways that disarm people and engages them in deeper conversation. The urgency of the situation is also made even clearer in the IPCC report, where we've learned that we have about a decade to address this issue definitively before it's too late. So we need the collective will among leaders and all sectors of society for greater ambition and commitments to move with greater urgency. Climate change is an issue as well of human rights and human dignity as well. And the most vulnerable communities suffer they suffer the most, despite being the ones who contributed the least to the causes of climate change. So, this we now understand, but we also need to make it better understood. The fact that climate change is a threat multiplier. So, be it security or inequality or political instability or poverty or migration, as we're seeing now, all of these issues are ones we're currently facing and are just going to be compounded by climate change. So this needs to be better communicated to people, and this is an area that, again, we're finding that young people are quite successful on this front. We also need to remember, though, that climate change is more than just, political forums and negotiations and science and data. It's a human issue, with human faces. So climate-induced migration has, already begun in the Pacific, in the Carteret Islands. Kiribati is recovering from drought in between king tides. California is still on fire. Bhutan has had a serious flood, a number of them. So we in the Pacific may already be the faces of climate change, but now we all are. And those of us on the front lines, like the Marshall Islands and Kiribati and other Pacific nations, are having to bear the full weight of this. So again, it is the young and the vulnerable who are having to both incur the debt of climate change and inherit a far less habitable planet. So, this is the reality many of us face, and I know many of us are aware of it, but, it bears repeating and repeating until we start making real progress, because this is the reality as, we have lived and as we have seen it. So necessarily this means that we do need far greater ambition, beginning with 1.5 to stay alive. We need a genuine, firm commitment from all parties at COP next month to ensure that NDCs and respective climate policies adhere to this principle. And we hope that the rulebook will hopefully lead to this. I keep saying that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is the difference between being able to survive and thrive in our islands and in our communities, or having to relocate and losing our lands and our heritage and the very source of our identity as Pacific people. So this is critical, and our Pacific leaders have been championing this, and they've led by example on this. The virtual summit we're in right now is an example of this, and we saw this again with President Haine's announcement this morning. We see this with young people who march and organize and speak out for the world that we want to inherit, for the livable earth that we want to thrive in. We've also seen this with faith leaders as well. And I think Laudato Si is a perfect example of that. It's a powerful text, and the Pope has really convicted and energized many of the faithful, and that's been followed by the Bishop's joint statement on climate justice last month. So all of this must be channeled into our work here and into COP24, and then from COP, a resolute commitment from all parties to meet the 1.5 mark. I think this can really be helped with Indigenous wisdom. I think meaningful, effective solidarity means listening to the wisdom of Indigenous communities who have been living in harmony with creation, communities that can teach us how to coexist with creation, communities who utilize this knowledge to survive on the front lines. We in the Pacific aren't just mere victims of the effects of climate change, but we're agents of environmental conservation as well. So we need to integrate the valuable practices and solutions that are offered by Indigenous communities into the vernacular of development work. And Samoan Tokelau, for example, one of our Pacific climate warriors, Mika Maiava, has been pioneering the introduction and spread of keyhole gardens to mass-produce food for communities on both islands. This is particularly important for areas where sea level rise has led to the salination of once fertile soil. And we also need to rethink how we produce and consume energy and resources. This means the urgent transformation of the energy sector, but as well as our own lifestyles. It means ending, the fossil fuel era and transitioning to renewable energy. It makes environmental sense, but it also makes economic sense because we're going to run out of fossil fuels reserves anyway. So, do we want to wait until it's too late before we begin the transition, or do we get serious now, leave fossil fuels in the ground, and actually start building a sustainable economy powered by renewable energy? At the same time, we need to rethink about how we consume. We live in a heavily energy-dependent world, but that in itself is situated within a culture of overconsumption. So in this respect, we need to rethink how, as individuals and as communities, how can we cut our ecological footprint and at a deeper level look to addressing this hyper-consumption and associated waste culture that we have. And again, this is where the wisdom of indigenous peoples and faith communities can really assist in transforming our habits of production and consumption. So, I don't know if I've gone over time, but essentially what I'm trying to say is what this ultimately boils down to, and as I mentioned this earlier, this current climate crisis requires greater understanding of our role as co-responsible stewards of this earth. We are co-responsible for ensuring that my generation and those after us inherit a livable, survivable planet in which we can thrive. And so we know what got us here, and we know what's going to take to get us out of here. And as the saying goes, once you are responsible. So we are co-responsible for ensuring the dignity of all people and for the protection of our common home. And that's something that, young people are energized and is a challenge that we're ready to undertake.
Thank you so much, Joe, and you're right on time. With that, I think I would take us directly into our final panelist, who actually takes a lot of these elements and wraps it up again in that profound ethical question of our co-responsibility, of the values that guide the world that we want to build and what we need to do about it. Once we know, as you said, well, then we have to get to it. So the final panelist in today with us is Professor Olivier de Schutter. He's co-chair of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And of course, he served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food from May 2008 to 2014. And in his presentation, he also will touch on the sustainability of the model or the unsustainability of the current model that we're in and how to get out of it. So I think we can just listen to his testimony, his video.
Good afternoon to all. I'm delighted to contribute to this Climate Vulnerability Forum Summit, and particularly to this session on an urgent call for a new development paradigm that works for people and planet. And I would like to present three key messages in order to help launch the discussion. The first message is that in the mainstream concept of development that we inherit from and on which largely discussions today are based, wealth creation is still seen as a condition for everything else. And as a result of this dominant development paradigm, we promote trade investment as a means to achieve economic growth. We tolerate speculation in the hope that resources shall go to actors best equipped to maximize production. We support large corporations in the name of the ability of large corporations to achieve economies of scale and thus to satisfy mass consumption. And both inequalities and environmental degradation are justified as a temporary price to be paid for this process of growth. And we are told that once higher levels of wealth shall be attained, it shall be possible to finance both redistributive policies and environmental measures in order to reduce inequalities and to compensate for the ecological damages caused. I believe we have to question this logic. What we see today indeed is that the means are prevailing over the ends. Increased trade and investment flows, higher levels of resource extraction, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the largest corporations, while still presented as instrumental in the process of development, as temporary and as reversible, have become, in fact, the ends pursued by public policies in all world regions. Governments have pursued wealth creation, not poverty reduction. They have pursued economic growth, not increased happiness and well-being. They have pursued the quantitative, not the qualitative, the figures, not the people. I would like to submit that environmental sustainability cannot be achieved, in fact, without social justice, and that neither of these two objectives can be achieved without changing the content of development, challenging the model of development that we inherit. Indeed, high levels of inequality, such as those we see today in many countries in the world, are simply unsustainable for four reasons. First of all, the more a society is unequal, the more economic growth is required to improve the situation of the poorest groups within the population. It is therefore in unequal societies that the ecological degradation can be presented as a price to pay for poverty reduction. This is a false dilemma, which I personally would like to reject. Secondly, inequality means that resources go to satisfying the tastes of the affluent parts of the population rather than to satisfy the basic needs of the poorest groups within the population. Markets, we should never forget, respond to demand as expressed by purchasing power, and the purchasing power of the rich in particular, and they are otherwise not responsive to social needs. Thirdly, inequality is unsustainable also because it encourages unsustainable forms of consumption, driven by status in the infinite quest to mimic the lifestyles of the rich, where what we need, in fact, today is to learn from the art of simplicity and sobriety taught by the poor. Fourth and finally, inequality is unsustainable because it is an obstacle to reform. As economic dominance translates into political influence, in political systems which allow the rich to exercise disproportionate power, the more unequally wealth is distributed, the more difficult it shall become to achieve societal transformation. The fight against inequalities, therefore, should be seen not only as a task of social policies modeled after those implemented in welfare states and advanced industrial societies, it should be at the heart of how the economy is organized. It should guide our choices as to how firms are managed, as to whom pockets the profits, as to which investments are made, as to which technologies are developed. The fight against inequality should form the basis for an inclusive economic system in which social and solidarity economy play a greater role, in which even profit-making corporations are strictly regulated and encouraged to contribute to the common good. A second message I would like to put forward concerns globalization. Globalization, which of course is both the result of technological advances and of political choices to lower the costs of exchanges and communication, to facilitate trade across borders and the free flow of investment. Globalization, I think, is problematic because it has presented one particular lifestyle based on overconsumption and waste as a model to be pursued by all. It has also led to extend the reach of intellectual property rights, although this can result in putting medicines and seeds beyond the reach of the poor in developing countries. And despite the obstacle that IP rights can represent for technology transfers, including the transfer of clean technologies that can help mitigate climate change. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly even, globalization has encouraged a global form of competition in which corporations may choose to segment the production process, to put people at work where employment is cheap, to pollute where environmental regulations are weak, and to declare profits where the taxes are low. As a result of these various forms of social, environmental, and fiscal dumping, governments have entered into a fierce and self-destructive form of regulatory competition. In their anxiety to attract investors or to retain them, they have renounced imposing that workers are paid decent wages, that resources are not overexploited, and that taxes are paid where the profits are made. In the end, all of us lose, except the handful of global corporations that are best equipped to benefit from the race to the bottom that globalization has encouraged. I'm struck by the fact that the proclamation of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 has not led to rethink the current shape of economic globalization. Now, at domestic level, governments are asked to achieve policy coherence for sustainable development. It is now high time that the same requirement is imposed on global institutions. It is time that rather than promoting free trade and the globalization of intellectual property rights, organizations such as the WTO or the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, work with the United Nations system in order to contribute to a form of development that is truly sustainable and pro-poor. It is time that the international financial institutions that give policy advice support a form of development that is genuinely pro-poor and sustainable, and that they abandon their insistence on imposing macroeconomic policies that prioritize GDP growth at the expense of everything else, and that rely on quantitative rather than on a qualitative understanding of development. It is time, in other terms, that the requirement of policy coherence for sustainable development applies to global governance and to the agencies that shape economic globalization, and not only to states. And my third message concerns the nature of innovation. And the reason I believe this third message is important is because for many years we've been hoping that the SDGs could be achieved by technological innovations. In fact, to a large extent, green growth is a hope that cleaner technologies shall allow to shift to more sustainable modes of production and consumption, and thus to reduce the ecological impacts of economic growth, allowing all populations to adopt the lifestyles of the most affluent countries without crossing the thresholds that endanger the viability of the planet and the future of human civilization. I believe this is an illusion. I believe that technological progress without lifestyle changes is unable to deliver the kind of transformation we need. In fact, under certain conditions, technological progress may increase consumption, an effect known as the rebound effect. In contrast, lifestyle changes that shall move us to simpler and more sober lives are what we need, and these lifestyle changes are prepared by the social innovations developed by the poor. Unlike technological innovations, social innovations cannot be fenced off by intellectual property rights. They are not handed over from scientists and engineers working in large firms to the end users. Instead, social innovations are democratic. They are shared in open access. They are grown organically and bottom up. They do not lead to centralization, but instead to decentralization. They do not lead to the dissemination of uniform solutions, demanding from people that they adapt to technologies that are imposed on them in the name of progress. Instead, social innovations promote and value diversity, the result of the search by local communities of the solutions that are best suited to the particular contexts in which they live. Social innovations do not disempower, and they do not result in new dependencies. They are instead empowering and promote autonomy and self-determination. In sum, what I would hope for is for a new model of development that supports social innovation's roles in changing lifestyles, that rethinks globalization so that it serves sustainable development and the needs of the poorest groups within populations, and a type of development that does not see wealth creation as a condition for all other objectives to be achieved. I would like to thank you, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion today.
So we just heard from Olivier, I think a pretty profound and wide-reaching analysis of how all these interconnected issues of the growth pattern are hurting creation and hurting us, and that the solutions will have to come from social innovations. This connects, I think, neatly with what Joe was saying about indigenous wisdom. But Melania, maybe you could share on that point of social innovation one quick, because we have only a short time for a few questions. Just share one example maybe of how women are standing up and pushing back and proposing alternatives to this extractivist colonial model.
Thank you very much. I think one perfect example where women are really pushing back on this extractivist model of development is in the DR Congo, where women are demanding that the knowledge of the indigenous women, that it should be recognized as knowledge, because it is in fact knowledge, and it is the knowledge that they had been using to protect their environment and also to protect their natural resources. And they are also saying that the dignity of women, of forest women, of peasant women in the DR Congo should be restored. That their dignity is dependent on their land and their natural resources and their environment, and therefore taking away their land, taking away and destroying their forests and their animals and their snakes, for example, takes away their dignity, because this is very much interconnected. And they would women are also challenging this financialization of the commons, the selling of their water bodies. Water does not belong to a corporation. It does not belong to an individual. It belongs to the people. And the people on the water, the indigenous people in the DRC, in Matadi, they are saying the Congo River does not belong to a corporation, and it has no monetary value, it's priceless, and therefore they would like that acknowledged, and these are the alternatives that they are leaving, and they would like a stop to the harmful projects. And therefore, to me, these are the alternatives that we are all talking about, that a lot of women, not only in the DR Congo, but in Africa, their lives depend on the land, and their livelihoods and their food depends on the land, that the land has no, it is a common property. It should not be privatized because it belongs to the people as a collective. Yeah, so those are some of the demands that women are putting forward, and these are some of the propositions. And also, one last thing is, women are also starting to question on how we acquire our knowledge, and who is the knower, who knows. And therefore, they would like that knowledge which they have on their forests, on their plants, on their animals and everything, that it should be counted as knowledge, because it is indeed knowledge, and that they know. Thank you.
Thank you, Melania. And to Joe, one final, maybe closing comment, or which I have a question for you, is when you say that you're a climate warrior, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to be a warrior? And if you could share with us where you draw your strength from, so that we can take it with us as well.
Yeah, the warrior in the Pacific context is first and foremost a guardian. Yeah? He or she protects the home, the culture, and the family. So the warrior is a steward and protecting what was inherited from the past, so that it may be passed on to the future. So as Pacific climate warriors, we see how the current crisis is but a symptom of a larger issue, that our relationship with creation has become exploitative and extractive. And so this is the root cause of the current crisis, and as such, that's why the warriors have risen in the way that we have as young people, and that's what gives us strength, knowing that what we're doing is fighting for this inheritance that we have been given, so that it can be passed on to the next generation. We're a seafaring people. We've been able to conquer the world's largest ocean. So, there's a heritage, a whole heritage and a history there that we cherish and that we'd like to pass on to the next generation. Our elders have modeled for us what sustainability looks like, what care for creation has looked like, and we've built entire cultures around that. And so, not only do we want to pass that on to our children, but we also want to pass that on to the rest of the world, so that they can learn as well from our example and examples from Africa and other parts of the world where Indigenous people have really role modeled what it means to be responsible and careful stewards of creation, and also to role model at a political level what true climate leadership looks like. So we really want to inspire our neighbors with the resilience, the imagination, and the resolve of Indigenous people in order to beat this crisis.
Thank you, Joe. So we've come to the end of our panel. We have just a few minutes left to sort of close and wrap up and draw maybe a few conclusions from everything that we've heard. We could have taken hours, of course, to discuss this. And if we put it together with all of the other panels that have happened during this incredible summit, there's a wealth of knowledge, I think, and wisdom, as you both put it. And we need to tap into that and share that and communicate it better to the world, as Joe put it. And how do we get that knowledge across, as Melania mentioned it, and get it recognized? I want to thank you for your courage and for coming and joining and sharing your voices. Our commitment, of course, is to make those voices heard as loud and as clear as possible from wherever we stand in our co-responsibility to propose an alternative and a different way of living. And as Bishop Medin was mentioning, Laudato Si and the encyclical letter of the Pope Francis, and that leadership, that spiritual guidance, that everything is interconnected, that all of these struggles are just one, that we're all part of it, that our bodies and the land are all interconnected. And so we're fighting for our own collective common survival and our own dignity. So this is the most important takeaway, I think, for us. And hopefully this message will be heard, will be voiced in the COP discussions, but beyond as well, and in everyday lives, because we have our own responsibilities, our own changes to make in our lifestyles, because in our everyday situations, we're contributing to this growth model. And we have to question that deeply. We really have to ask questions, difficult questions about how we live and what we put out as messages into the world. I think also that something else that came up in all of your presentations is the courage of our convictions and of our principles. And maybe that's something that we as the activists, either coming from the faith movements or from the youth or from the indigenous groupings, can put forward, is that special added element of our convictions and of our beliefs that something better is necessary and that we deserve it as human beings and as elements of creation, parts of creation. Unless you have one last thing to say, I just want to say thank you again. I think it's been a great honor for us to be part of this with you, to share this table, this virtual table with you. And again, offer you maybe one last word of closing, because we have 2 minutes left. So you each have a few seconds if there's anything more you want to say as we say goodbye.
Thank you very much. I would like to say it's high time we start questioning what is a good life, and start questioning our consumption habits, and start also re-looking at our relationship with nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Melania.
And just from me, it's a critical moment of co-responsibility, and the young people are ready to power us and get us there. We just need our elders and political leaders to show the way and show some political courage.
So let's meet up again somewhere else soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.